The luxurious first-class cabin of Flight 417 from Los Angeles to New York was a haven of comfort. Wide leather seats, unlimited champagne, and a level of exclusivity that only the wealthiest could afford. Among the privileged few in this section was Nathan Carter, a successful hedge fund manager in his early 40s. Tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, and radiating arrogance. He was the kind of man who believed money equaled superiority. As the boarding process wrapped up, Nathan glanced at the passenger list on his phone. He always made it a point to research who would be in first class with him. It was useful for networking or more often, for measuring himself against the competition. A name stood out. Chuck Norris. Nathan snorted. That washed-up action star? He had grown up watching Chuck's movies but never understood why people admired him so much. To him, Chuck Norris was just another celebrity past his prime, living off old glory. Nathan, on the other hand, had built his wealth through numbers, power plays, and intelligence. He had no patience for nostalgia or sentimental hero worship. As he sipped his whiskey, the flight attendant announced that all passengers were on board. That's when he saw him. Chuck Norris entered the cabin wearing a simple black shirt, jeans, and cowboy boots. His signature beard and piercing blue eyes carried an aura of quiet confidence. But instead of carrying himself like a Hollywood superstar, Chuck moved with an effortless humility, greeting the flight attendants and even shaking hands with the pilot. Nathan rolled his eyes. What a joke. Chuck took his seat just across from Nathan, adjusting his seatbelt with a calm ease. It was then that Nathan decided to make his move. He leaned over with a smirk. Well, look who we have here. The great Chuck Norris. Didn't think you could still afford first class. Chuck turned to him, his expression unreadable. Good evening, he said, his voice steady and warm. Nathan wasn't satisfied with the simple greeting. He wanted a reaction. I gotta ask, how does it feel to be a relic? I mean, back in the day you were something, but now, you're basically a meme. A couple of other passengers in first class shifted uncomfortably. The flight attendants, who had been standing nearby, exchanged glances. Chuck simply chuckled. Well, if I've made people laugh, that's something, isn't it? Nathan scoffed. Yeah, sure. But let's be real, you're not really Chuck Norris anymore. You're just an old guy trying to hold on to the past. Must be tough watching the world move on. The flight attendant appeared, sensing the tension. Sir, can I get you something? She asked Chuck. Chuck smiled. Just water, please. Nathan laughed. Water? No champagne? No whiskey? Come on, live a little. Chuck's eyes met Nathan's. I prefer to stay clear-headed. You never know when you might need to be. Nathan snickered. What, in case a bad guy suddenly hijacks the plane? Relax, man. This is first class, not one of your old action movies. The other passengers chuckled nervously, unsure whether to laugh along or stay out of it. Chuck, however, remained composed, his face unreadable. Just then, a well-dressed older woman, seated 2 rows behind, leaned forward. Excuse me, young man, she said to Nathan. Do you even know who you're talking to? Nathan rolled his eyes again. Yeah, Chuck Norris. Walker, Texas Ranger. Internet jokes. That's about it. The woman shook her head. You don't have a clue, do you? Nathan raised an eyebrow. And what exactly am I missing? Chuck shifted in his seat, but before he could answer, the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing takeoff. Nathan smirked, thinking he had won this round. Little did he know, he was about to receive the most humbling lesson of his life. As the plane soared above the clouds, the tension in the first-class cabin lingered. Nathan leaned back in his seat, still amused by his own remarks. In his world, money and power defined worth, and to him, Chuck Norris was nothing more than a fading star clinging to a bygone era. He glanced across the aisle. Chuck Norris sat quietly, sipping his water, unbothered by the insult. There was something about his calm demeanor that irritated Nathan. How could someone who had been publicly mocked for years sit so peacefully without a trace of insecurity? The flight attendant returned, offering hot towels. Nathan accepted his with a smug nod while Chuck declined politely. So, Nathan said, breaking the silence again. What do you even do these days? Martial arts demonstrations at county fairs. Chuck smiled faintly. I spend most of my time working with veterans and supporting children's charities. Nathan raised an eyebrow. Charities? Must be nice when you don't have a real job. A quiet murmur spread among the other first-class passengers. Some shifted uncomfortably, but no one dared to intervene. You know, Nathan continued, guys like you fade away because you can't keep up. Meanwhile, I'm building an empire. Hedge funds, tech investments, you wouldn't understand. It takes brains, not fists. Chuck turned his head slightly, his gaze steady and patient. And what does that empire do for others? The question caught Nathan off guard. What do you mean? I mean, Chuck said softly. When the lights go out and no one's watching, does your empire make the world better? Or just your bank account? Nathan laughed, shaking his head. Please, this is the real world, not some feel-good movie. People respect power, not charity. That's why I'm here, because I earned it. Chuck didn't flinch. And you think money makes you better than others? Nathan leaned in, his voice dropping to a mocking whisper. It sure makes me better than some washed-up action star riding on Old Glory. For a moment, the cabin grew silent. Even the hum of the engines seemed distant. Chuck tilted his head slightly, studying Nathan with the kind of calm that came from a lifetime of discipline. Let me tell you something, Chuck said quietly. Respect doesn't come from what's in your wallet. It comes from what's in your heart. And if you judge a man by his bank balance, you're missing out on what truly matters. Nathan rolled his eyes again. Spare me the fortune cookie wisdom. In the real world, nice guys finish last. Chuck smiled, but there was a glint of something deeper behind his eyes. A strength that no amount of arrogance could shake. You'd be surprised, he said. As Nathan prepared another snarky comment, the older woman from earlier leaned forward again. Young man, she said firmly. Do you even know who this man really is? Nathan sighed dramatically. Yes, Chuck Norris. Karate guy. Internet joke. What's your point? The woman's expression hardened. I was a nurse during the Vietnam War. You think he's just some celebrity? This man flew to combat zones, unarmed, to visit soldiers who had been forgotten. He risked his life to bring hope to men who thought the world had left them behind. Nathan's smirk faded slightly. And after his career, she continued, he didn't retire to a mansion and forget the world. He's built programs to help children fight life-threatening diseases. He's funded scholarships for underprivileged youth. What have you done lately, besides insult people? The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. For the first time since takeoff, Nathan had no quick comeback. Chuck gave the woman a respectful nod. Thank you for your service, ma'am, he said softly. Nathan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Okay, fine, he mumbled. So he's done some charity work. Big deal. Chuck leaned back, his voice even. It's not about making a big deal. It's about doing the right thing when no one's watching. But I don't expect you to understand that right now. Nathan's jaw tightened, his confidence beginning to crack. He had come onto this flight thinking he was the most important person in the room. But now, the ground beneath his arrogance was starting to feel shaky. And Chuck Norris? He hadn't lifted a finger. But somehow, he was delivering a lesson Nathan would never forget. The hum of the engines filled the silence as Nathan shifted in his plush leather seat, struggling to regain the cocky confidence he wore like armor. Yet, Chuck Norris's quiet dignity and the older woman's words gnawed at the edges of his pride. For a moment, Nathan considered backing down, letting the conversation fade into an awkward memory. But his ego wouldn't allow it. He couldn't let himself be outdone by a man he saw as outdated. So you hand out scholarships and visit soldiers, Nathan said, forcing a chuckle. That's cute. But the world's not going to change because you threw a few bucks at charity. Power changes the world. Influence. I mean, come on. You wouldn't even be sitting here if it weren't for the money you made from those cheesy movies. Chuck raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor unwavering. And what has your power done lately, besides boost your ego? Nathan's smirk faltered. You see, Chuck continued, real strength isn't about control or how much you can take. It's about how much you give. I learned that a long time ago. Maybe it's a lesson you'll figure out one day. The words hung heavy in the air, as if challenging Nathan's entire belief system. But he wasn't ready to surrender. You talk a good game, Nathan said, narrowing his eyes. But let's be honest, if you didn't have your name, no one would care. You're riding on your past while people like me are shaping the future. Chuck sighed softly, as if he'd heard this argument 1,000 times before, and perhaps in a way he had. He didn't respond with anger or condescension. Instead, he spoke with the kind of calm that comes from knowing exactly who you are. Let me tell you a story, Chuck said quietly. Nathan huffed, but curiosity flickered in his eyes. When I was young, about your age, I thought the same way you do, Chuck began. I thought that success was about winning, and winning meant being better than everyone else. I trained harder, fought harder, and I earned my titles. World Karate Champion 6 times. But there was an emptiness in it. I didn't understand why, not at first. He paused, his gaze distant for a moment. Then one day I got a letter. It was from a soldier stationed overseas. He said my movies gave him hope on nights when he thought he wouldn't make it. That letter changed me. Nathan blinked, his expression unreadable. So I started visiting the troops. I went to war zones, not for a paycheck, not for headlines, but because I knew what it meant to feel forgotten. And you know what I learned? Chuck's voice softened. Nathan leaned forward slightly, despite himself. I learned that the toughest men in the world aren't the ones with the most money or the biggest muscles, Chuck said. They're the ones who serve others, even when no one's watching. And when you spend your life building walls around yourself, you miss the chance to make a real difference. For a fleeting second, Nathan's mask of arrogance slipped. Something in Chuck's words struck a nerve, a memory he had tried to bury. His father. Nathan's father had worked 2 jobs to send him to private school. He wasn't a wealthy man. He didn't sit in first class. But he had sacrificed everything so Nathan could succeed. And what had Nathan given back? Nothing except distance and condescension. Why are you even telling me this? Nathan asked, his voice quieter than before. Chuck smiled faintly. Because everyone gets a choice. You can spend your life proving how important you are, or you can use what you have to lift others up. And from where I'm sitting, you've got a lot to give. Nathan opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time in a long time, he had nothing to say. The older woman behind them, who had been quietly observing, gave a small nod of approval. Even the flight attendant, still refilling glasses, seemed to move with a new sense of respect toward Chuck. Nathan swallowed hard, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Humility. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the biggest man in the room after all. Nathan stared out the window, the endless sky stretching beyond the horizon. Chuck's words echoed in his mind, unsettling the self-image he had built over years of ruthless ambition. For so long, he had measured his worth by the size of his bank account, the exclusivity of his lifestyle, and his ability to dominate any room he entered. But now, sitting across from a man who embodied quiet strength, he felt something else, something unfamiliar. Doubt. He took a slow breath, struggling to shake off the discomfort. Look, he said, forcing a laugh to hide the unease creeping into his chest. I get it. You're a nice guy, but the world doesn't reward kindness, it rewards power. People respect me because I win. Chuck tilted his head slightly. Do they respect you? Or do they fear what you can take from them? Nathan flinched. The question hit harder than he wanted to admit. Let me guess, Chuck continued, his tone gentle but firm. You work long hours. You don't trust anyone fully. And no matter how much you earn, it's never enough. Because deep down, you're afraid that if you stop moving, everything will fall apart. Nathan clenched his jaw. I worked for everything I have. No one handed me anything. I believe you, Chuck said, nodding. But what did it cost you? Nathan fell silent. He didn't want to think about what his ambition had taken, friendships left behind, a strained relationship with his father, and the gnawing emptiness that no promotion or luxury could fill. I know what it's like, Chuck continued. I spent years chasing titles, thinking the next win would bring peace. But it doesn't work that way. You can fill your life with trophies, but if you lose yourself in the process, none of it matters. Nathan shook his head, more to himself than to Chuck. Easy for you to say. You already had your moment. I'm still building mine. Chuck's face softened. Your moment isn't about what you build. It's about what you leave behind. One day the deals will end. The money won't matter, but the people you impact. That lasts. Nathan let out a breath, leaning back in his seat. For years, he had dismissed these kinds of sentiments as weakness, excuses made by people who couldn't keep up. But sitting across from a man who had seen more of life than he could imagine, those words felt different, truer. Why do you care? Nathan asked quietly. Why even bother trying to make me understand? Chuck smiled, a quiet, knowing smile. Because someone once took the time to teach me when I didn't deserve it. And you? You're not as lost as you think. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For the first time in years, Nathan felt something shift inside. A crack in the armor he had worn for so long. He thought of his father again. The man who had given everything so his son could succeed, yet had never heard a word of gratitude in return. What would he say if he could see Nathan now? Arrogant, isolated, so consumed with proving his worth that he had forgotten the people who had loved him before he had anything. The realization felt like a punch to the gut. Nathan swallowed hard. You think it's too late to change? Chuck leaned forward, his voice warm but steady. It's never too late to say thank you, to make things right, or to choose a better path. But that's up to you. Nathan sat in silence, the weight of Chuck's words sinking deep. The truth was, for all his power, he had never felt smaller or more human. The flight continued its smooth journey through the sky, but inside Nathan's mind, a storm brewed. For years, he had built his life on a foundation of arrogance, convinced that wealth and influence were the ultimate measures of success. Yet here was a man who had every reason to flaunt his legacy, but chose humility instead. Nathan shifted in his seat, trying to ignore the ache growing in his chest. He wasn't used to feeling small. He wasn't used to being questioned. But something about Chuck's words pierced through the defenses he had spent years constructing. I don't know if I can change, Nathan admitted, his voice quieter now, almost vulnerable. I've spent so much time climbing the ladder, I wouldn't even know where to start. Chuck gave a small nod, his expression thoughtful. Change isn't about flipping a switch, he said. It's about small steps. Every day you get to decide what kind of man you want to be. Nathan looked down at his hands. The expensive watch on his wrist gleamed under the cabin lights, a symbol of everything he had worked for. But for the first time it felt hollow. You know, Chuck continued, I once heard a simple piece of advice that stuck with me. Success is not about how much you have. It's about how much you give away. You've been blessed with opportunities most people can only dream of. Imagine what you could do if you used that influence to lift others up instead of tearing them down. Nathan exhaled slowly. And what if I fail? Chuck's smile was warm, understanding. You will, he said, chuckling softly. I've failed more times than I can count. But failure's not the end. It's just part of the process. The real failure is never trying to be better. For a long time, Nathan didn't speak. The hum of the engines and the gentle clinking of glasses around them filled the silence. But inside, something was shifting. He thought of his father, how much he had sacrificed to give Nathan a better life. And yet, Nathan had spent years looking down on the very values his father had embodied. Kindness, humility, and hard work. Was it too late to make things right? He reached for his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found his father's number. His thumb hovered over the call button. It had been months since they last spoke. Months filled with shallow conversations and half-hearted check-ins. Chuck noticed and gave a slight nod of encouragement. It's never the wrong time to do the right thing. With a deep breath, Nathan pressed the button and held the phone to his ear. It rang once, twice, and then a familiar voice. Nathan. His father sounded surprised, and older than Nathan remembered. Hey, Dad. Nathan said, his voice softer than usual. I've been thinking. I just wanted to say thank you. For everything. I wouldn't be here without you. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When his father finally spoke, his voice trembled with emotion. I'm proud of you, son. Nathan swallowed the lump rising in his throat. For years, he had chased the admiration of strangers. Yet here was the only approval that ever truly mattered. I want to do better, Nathan said quietly. I want to be better. You already are, his father said. When the call ended, Nathan sat back, feeling a strange weight lift from his chest. It wasn't a business deal. It wasn't a promotion. But it felt more real, more important than anything he had accomplished before. Chuck gave a small smile. Feels good, doesn't it? Nathan laughed softly, shaking his head. Yeah, it does. The plane began its descent, and the flight attendants moved through the cabin preparing for landing. Nathan glanced at Chuck one last time, a new sense of respect settling over him. You know, he said, I spent the whole flight thinking I was the biggest guy in the room. Turns out I was wrong. Chuck grinned. Being the biggest doesn't matter. Being the best version of yourself does. As the plane touched down, Nathan felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a different way to live. A better way. And it had all started with a simple conversation. As they disembarked, Nathan turned to Chuck and extended his hand. Thank you. For everything. Chuck shook his hand firmly. You're welcome. Now go make a difference. And with that, the man who had built his empire on kindness and quiet strength walked away, leaving Nathan with a heart a little fuller and a new path to follow. Because sometimes the greatest lessons come from the most unexpected places. And true class is never about money. It's about character,